This is Steve Arney, interviewing Damian Macey on December 13th, 2016, as a part of the Public Library Oral History Project. Good morning, Damian.
Good morning, Steve. Good to be here, in spite of the snow.
Yes, it's snowing heavily here at the moment, but we're warm and toasty here in the back of the library. Damian, let's begin with you're talking a little bit about your ancestors and how they came to Clark County.
I'll even go back
Brought you here.
a generation or two. My great-great-grandfather was from Ireland, County Donegal, and emigrated here in the early 1800s. Matter of fact, it was about 1826, we think. He came through New York and came out to Ohio, and he signed his Pledge of Allegiance to the United States in 1830. And I do have a photocopy of that. He married a lady from Ohio. Her name was Rachel Culver. His name was Robert Wilson. And they moved on out to this wilderness called Illinois. And he acquired about 10,000 acres. And he established a town called Castle Finn. And it was reminiscent of some of the area that he had left in Ireland. And the area just west of Castle Finn was an area they called the Barrens, Barrens. And that was kind of the nature of the property. It was bare, and there was just prairie, very little woods or anything at that time. He built a 2-story house, and as people came over from Ireland, he was helping them, and he would sell them off some acres to get started, and many times even helped them by staying in his house. They were not Catholic, but most of the immigrants were. They had a large 2-room parlor on the front of the house with doors that opened up in between. And that was the largest place for gathering in Castle Finn. So traveling priests from a place called North Arm, which is the first parish in Illinois, north of Paris, or Vincennes, or sometimes Terre Haute, priests would come by horseback and have the service or say Mass in their home. And as he developed, he actually plotted the town. I've got a photocopy of the plot with the streets all laid out in Castle Finn. He set aside about 10 acres to build a church and a cemetery. Well, about this same time, the National Road, of course, had gone through here, then the railroad in the 1850s. So nothing really happened in Castle Finn. And as Marshall developed, Castle Finn kind of faded into the sunset. But over these years, people from there, some of them moved into Marshall. Now that property is still owned by St. Mary's Church here in Marshall. So we've got some roots going way back to the early family. They settled, and my grandmother was one of the first parishioners of St. Mary's Church here in Marshall. And that became my great-great-grandmother. My great-grandmother was a McManus, and she married a gentleman. Then their daughter, which was Molly McManus, married Tom Madden, which is my grandparents. And they were the parents of my mother, Gertrude Madden. From that, we've got, another generation. Mother came through teaching, was a teacher for 30-some years. And most of it were in 1-room schools. She loved the 3rd and 4th grade. And of course that education of hers, I think, kind of rubbed off on me a little bit, that you do study and education is so darn important.
So were the whole 10,000 acres in this East Central Illinois area?
Mm-hmm. I still own 40 acres of that original 10,000.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
And it was not wooded, it was all pretty much
most of it
cleared.
Was cleared.
Ready for farming.
Mm-hmm. That was why it was valuable to them. That's why they call it barrens, because there's some of it wooded. Right around the Castle Finn area, there's rough area. But I don't know where he had, I guess he probably had some money to come with. But at that time, there's a lot of homesteading done that if you took care of and were willing to do the work to get it established, I think the government cooperated with you in making it possible.
Okay, so were you born here in Clark County?
I was born in Terre Haute, Indiana. My mother had married Damian Macey, who was from Martinsville, and I was born in September of 1937.
And you went to school in Martinsville, is that right?
My parents lived here in Marshall. Mother taught. She taught some to Southside School and in Stringtown and a lot of other one-room schools. And my dad at one time worked for John Newberry, shoveling coal, taking care of that. He always was interested in farming. And he was managing of they call it the co-op at that time, which was a feed supply company. And then later was assistant cashier of the First National Bank at that time. I went to the old Northside School. We lived up on Cypress Street, and I was not too keen on going to school, even though Mother was a teacher. And I tried to bargain with my parents, and they didn't agree to it. We were just a couple blocks from the high school, about 3 blocks. And I tried to bargain with my parents that school was a lot closer, that I'd go there first, and if I liked it, then I'd go up to the Northside School.
So you graduated from Marshall High School?
No. I went the first 4 years to the old Northside School. Very, very memorable time. Walked there all the time, and I remember my teachers very well. Louise Clark Phoenix was my first grade teacher. Georgie Connerton was my second grade teacher, and she also was one of my mother's teachers. At that time, it was kind of unusual to have next generation in the classroom. And then Irene Klein and Ethel Hutchison was the 4th grade. My dad bought a business in Martinsville, and we moved to Martinsville about 1947, 48 area, and I went 5th grade on in Martinsville.
Just for the record, those names you mentioned are familiar to me. I had the same teachers, Irene Klein, Ethel Hutchison, I remember specifically. Those were good times.
They really were, and I think it was an adjustment moving. I guess we had never moved before, and I was a little hesitant about school. But there was one thing that I guess was a common thread. I was taking music lessons. Started the 6th grade with her name was Maddie Edens, and I took piano lessons from there. So when we moved to Martinsville, I was kind of, oh, do I continue or not? And my dad said, "Now we'll give you lessons." Ruth Tarman was a teacher over there at that time, and I'll call her up and make reservations and get you started with lessons over here. Dad had the phone. I said, "Nope, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to." He said, "Too late. I've already got her on the line." And she'd answered about that time. And I continued on with lessons all the way through high school.
I took lessons for a while from Matty Eden also.
Did you?
Yes.
Okay.
How was your life in Martinsville? Expand a little on that.
It was a very, very enjoyable. I had, I would say, a wonderful childhood. My mother being a teacher, I had no brothers or sisters, but mother being a teacher, she was always working with me for math, English, reading. She always insisted I read a lot. We went to the library, I think, about every week. And the thing with the teachers there, they kind of continued a lot of the philosophies that I think were in Marshall. And that was a continuity thing that, wasn't like a big disruptive influence in education. I had a lady named Greta Lee as my 5th grade teacher, and continued with piano lessons with Ruth Tarman. Then through the 6th, 7th, 8th grade, very, very active, continued with music, and then played in the Marshall band, city band of Martinsville at that time. And that music was always a part of my life. I started learning clarinet. As a matter of fact, my dad finally bought me a new clarinet. I had an old metal one that I had bargained for. I got a new clarinet in 1949. I still have that, and I used it in the city band here
Really?
for 35 years. So education in Martinsville was really, I think, great. I'm glad I lived in a small town. You knew your teachers, you knew your community, and I needed to, of course, make a few pesos. My dad was always one of, you want something, you have to work for it. And I started mowing yards when I was 10 and put those dollars away if I could. And finally bought my own gasoline then when I was using my own mower. But I got up to 13 yards. And when there's a little rain and some nasty weather, that was kind of a chore to get all those worked in a week. And three of them were huge. One of them was the Snavely's, one of them was the Sinclairs, and the other was Homer Johnson. And they were all really taskmasters because they wanted it the way they wanted it. And you didn't slough off, and I worked at it. I remember the first time I did Homer Johnson's. My dad said, I know him real well, he's a fussy man, be sure you do it right. So I had finished the yard. I thought, I trimmed around everything by hand clippers. So I think everything looks pretty good. And I knocked on the back door and I said, Mr. Johnson, I'm finished with your yard. His comment was, like hell you are. And that really unnerved me. He was an adult, I really didn't know that well. And to use that language, he said, you didn't sweep the front walks. There's grass on those walks and in the gutter. So I learned promptly that to finish the yard, wherever it was, I swept the walks and cleaned out the gutters. But I think that was also a good lesson of, right to the nth degree, you do what is needed to make it look right. And during, I believe it was my junior year and part of my senior year, I was looking again for a few more pesos. And I talked to the principal at school and said, hey, is there something work here at school? So those couple of years, I was assistant janitor, and after school, helped sweep out the building, dump the garbage cans, and that was also an education. But it taught a good work ethic, I think.
I know what you're talking about. I mowed yards also back in those days. Not 13, that was beyond my capability, but I remember the wages weren't very good and we didn't use power lawnmowers. So it was pretty hard work.
I did have a gasoline mower.
Oh, you did?
I did. The first one was a real mower. And of course it didn't clean up buckhorn and dandelions or anything, so would use a swinging scythe to clean that stuff up before you mowed. But then I bought a Jacobson power mower. That was a rotary one that really slicked things up. But I did fortunately have a power mower.
How much did you get it per yard?
I always did them by the hour.
Oh.
Right from the beginning, I charged 75 cents an hour.
Oh, okay.
And on something like the Snavely yard, it was usually always a good 4 hours. Mm-hmm. And you cleaned out the bird baths and you cleaned the mulch up and all of those things. So it amounted to a few bucks at that time.
Yeah.
But I compare that to what we pay now. Unreal.
Well, 13 yards would be almost a full-time job.
It was.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so you got through high school in 1955?
56.
1956. And
we had our 60th anniversary this last year, reunion.
Married Eleanor Mealing.
After Martinsville High School and my association in Marshall, we always went to church here at St. Mary's. So I had known Eleanor for a long time, but I went on to Indiana State. She'd graduated a year ahead of me in Marshall, and we were both at Indiana State. I majored in business. She was majoring in education to teach. She graduated in 55 and went to teaching in Robinson. I graduated in 56 and left this part of the country. I had an opportunity to work in Chicago for Carson Perry Scott. And I was interested in retail business, and I interviewed several places, but I was excited about that and really looked forward to going to the city. My mother and dad were kind of dubious, but that was a new experience, and I had a good job and was well respected, paying for rent on an apartment, paying for a train trip to get downtown. I still put away a few pesos, and matter of fact, I started my retirement plan the second month that I was at Carson's. I went down the street, and they didn't have IRAs right then, but I set money aside for retirement out of savings savings and loan bank down the street. I worked for Carson Perry Scott for a number of years. Started out in the internal audit department, which again, used of my accounting. And then I was promoted to assistant cashier, which was managing all of the cashiers in the stores and the money, the checks that came in. And that was really quite an operation, and people don't realize at that time the entire payroll of the downtown store, St. Madison in Chicago, employees were paid by cash except the executive level.
Really?
So every Thursday we had 5 people lined up with change machines and all, putting the cash in envelopes. So that took quite a bit of money, but again, that was part of the managing. And I'd go down to the First National Bank or Continental every once in a while to take care of some of the things. During that time, I was kind of concerned about the thing called the draft. The balloon buildup and all these things had kind of created a lot of waves. So I finally joined the National Guard unit in Chicago. It was hard to get in. I went to 3 or 4 of them before I found an opening. And I thought, well, maybe I'll get to stay home for a while. But in early 1962, I got that little notice that said, report to Fort Leonard Wood. So going down there in January was a terrible experience. Winter, snow. The old barracks were from 1940s, from the war. They were wood, coal furnace to keep you warm. Didn't do a very good job either. But I did survive it and was there only 6 months because I did the last, I think this was the last 6 weeks. I was an instructor at the NCO Academy. I fortunately got that, which was kind of an easy way to exit the military. And in the meantime, I had become engaged. I had given Eleanor a ring, and we had set September as our wedding date. So I got out of the military and went back to Carson's. They had a job for me, and we were married in September of 1962. And I fortunately got a nice promotion from that to the manager of the accounts payable department, which is quite a level at that time, and some nice pesos too, but peanuts compared to what you see today. But we were rented an apartment, lived in Evanston, and Eleanor decided, well, she would go ahead and make use of that degree that she had in teaching. So she taught in the Skokie school system, which is a huge, huge school system. They had a new school that I think was about 4,000 students. So from teaching in Robinson or being in Marshall to a school of 4,000 students was quite an experience for her too. But we lived in Evanston, nice place right along the water. And then an opportunity came along, and I left Carson's and went to a place called Baxter Laboratories, which was a huge pharmaceutical company. At that time, their headquarters was in Morton Grove. So I could no longer take the train to work, but I had to drive. That was a good long haul out there. But was in the accounting department, and then was promoted to assistant internal auditor and directing the internal audit staff. At that time, it was a lot of travel. A nice experience, but after a while, sitting in airports, eating hotel food, that gets old too. But one year I think I traveled almost 100,000 miles.
All over the country?
All over the country. I'd come in on Friday night, take the shuttle or the limo home. Eleanor would take me back to the airport on Sunday evening. So it got to be kind of a chore. And in 1968, I had gone out to, Eleanor and I had tried to have children. We were unsuccessful, so we had learned of a couple of children available for adoption. They were in a orphanage in Vincennes, brother and sister. So in 1968, after a long, long process between 2 states, we're finally able to adopt them, their brother and sister, George and Emma. Emma's the oldest. She was 6 at that time, and George was 5. So they've certainly become very much a part of our life. In also 1968, I did get my master's degree from DePaul University. I've been going to night school. Sure glad to have that finished. But a company I worked for, Baxter Laboratory, was very insistent on a master's degree. If you're going to move up in the company, they really expected a master's degree. But that travel got to be a little bit heavy and a little bit old. And more than once, I was somewhere, and my superior, my boss would call me up on Friday evening. I was about ready to leave and say, I want you in Los Angeles Monday morning. Well, that wasn't in my original plan. So that happened about 3 or 4 times, and the last time I was in Los Angeles, and he called me, and I want you in Toronto, Canada, Monday morning. Well, I said, that's kind of it. So I started looking for another job and found a great opportunity with a company called City Products. And they had, again, back in retail, kind of made a turn back to it. They had the Ben Franklin stores, TGI stores, City Ice in Chicago, and quite a number of different retail operations. So I went there. They were developing a new project of installing computers.
Say again?
Installing computers.
Installing computers.
And they had basically done pretty much manual operations all the way through, inventory control and everything. But the gentleman who headed up their IT, or their program of computers and installation of them, was absolutely a whiz on inventory and inventory control. And of course, retail inventory is a huge part of things like Ben Franklin stores. So I worked for a couple of years on their project of installing computer systems in the retail branches. And they had, not in the stores, but in the warehouses. They had 7 warehouses. So I spent that first year, biggest part of the time, in Minnesota, outside of Minneapolis. All the time of flying up there and renting a car. Never got snowbound. But there were 5 of us on the team, and we did the writing of the manuals, set procedures, and really worked with developing the system to control for billing and all. So my part of it was writing the manuals for the accounting department of how to
operate the computer
operate,
system.
and also then how to do the billing and the function to the customer even after that. And that was really quite a challenge, because the people I worked with were great. Really computer whizzes. One was on inventory, one was warehouse guys. So it really helped dovetail a lot of parts of a business coming together in one focal point. And then we were the ones that went out and installed it first in Minneapolis, then in Baltimore, and then some of the others. And then after that, I was promoted to assistant controller of the Chicago region of Ben Franklin stores.
What year was this again?
Oh, that was that would have been 1970.
Well, you were in the forerunning of computers.
It really was.
Using them in business.
1400 series computer, I think it was the big thing. And the use of storage devices was all kinds of things coming out then. One of them was a drum. And I remember they tried it, and it just wasn't fast enough. And what it was a drum of magnetic strips. And the information was stored on that drum. And they would pull that little strip out, it was read, and then put it back. And it sounded good, but it just was too slow. Then came the disc. And really, we used cards very little. Most everything was right into that use of the disc. And the development of that system was unique, and you might say in the forerunner of it, it really, really was.
Yes.
The gentleman who was the head of the computer department at that time was a gentleman named Don Soderquist. I met a guy named Walton, who started the Walmart stores. He started with the Ben Franklin store, and he was wanting to grow and grow and grow. He then basically converted his Ben Franklin store to a first Walmart store in Bentonville, Arkansas.
This was Sam Walton?
Sam Walton. But he was in our office every once in a while, and I got a chance to meet him. So Don Soderquist, who was the head of the data processing department, this was even after I left the company, was hired as executive to do their inventory control on Walmart. He later worked his way up, was assistant chairman of the board. So, and I visited with him when he was chairman of the board in Bentonville. It was kind of unusual because here's this huge company. Of course, it's changed a lot since then. They had Samsonite folding chairs for vendors to sit on when they came in. His office, no carpeting, was asphalt tile. And he had a metal desk, but that was Sam Walton's philosophy. You don't do anything flamboyantly or spend money unless you really have to. But having worked with him, had a good image, and it was interesting to see the way Walmart developed from just knowing him.
Mm-hmm. It's an amazing story. So at some point you got into the investment business, did you not?
Well, yeah, that was a little later. In the early 1970s, again, we visited home. And in we had moved to Lake Forest from Evanston in the late 1860s, 1970. Beautiful home, wonderful neighbors. But we always had that thought, well, maybe sometime we might return back to Marshall. And in 1974, we were home at Thanksgiving dinner. My dad had retired from the business he owned, an insurance business, and was working for Burton Klein, doing some real estate work. He mentioned at the dining room table, excuse me, all the old Burnett houses for sale. I said, oh, really? Could we see that? Well, yeah, I've got the keys, or I can get the keys for you. Well, that was the one built by Robert Delaney on North 6th Street. And as a youngster living on Cypress Street, walking to the old Northside School, I walked by there every day. And I always said, someday I'd kind of like to own a house like that. I always loved architecture, houses. So that visit at Thanksgiving was kind of our downfall. Dad showed us the house. It was empty. The folks had gone to California that owned it at that time. Harold Walker, who worked for Indiana State, had taken a job in California. So the house was empty. We had a lot of time to look through it and take some pictures. We were just kind of saying, oh, that's kind of nice, but maybe it's a long way out there before we ever go back to Marshall. So I took my wife out for Valentine's dinner in 1975, and we'd thought about it. I said, what would you really think about moving back to Marshall? And I think she swallowed the steak or whatever she had whole at that time. So we talked long and hard about it and decided, well, why not? At our age now might be a time to do it. So again, my dad was working in the real estate. We talked to him by phone, came home then and said, well, should we do it? Dad said, if you're going to, now's the time. It's not going to get any cheaper either to buy houses. Well, my mother, being very conservative, she was not in favor of that at all. She just said, oh, costs are going to eat you up in that big house. You don't have a job yet. What are you going to do? She was really almost tried to talk us out of it. So anyway, we finally made an offer on it, and it took about a month of negotiation back and forth. And finally, I forget even now where we were. We were not at home. We were on a trip, I think, and Dad called us and said, you've got a house. So then we had two of them. A very expensive house in Lake Forest and one here, which was kind of a sobering thought too. So we immediately put the house in Lake Forest on the market, and we purposely said don't put a sign out in front because I hadn't told the company I was working for, City Products. So I sat down with my superior, and Don Soderquist was one of them, and said, here's what, and so they were all very much, hey, when you got an opportunity, take it. At that time also, we said, gosh, what am I going to do for work? So there was a company in Terre Haute at that time called Bindley Drug Company. It was a wholesale drug distributor for drugstores around through Wabash Valley. They were looking for a controller. Theirs was leaving. One of the Bentley family lived in Chicago. So I got in touch with him, and he called me up, and we interviewed. So they hired me to start. Matter of fact, right after we could move in September. So we moved in September of 1975. And for almost 3 months, we came down almost every weekend. Brought a carload of dishes and things down that we didn't want to have to pack. And our children were coming down that way too. Well, I was going to work for a drug wholesaler, but the word drug, the rumor got started that we were drug runners.
Oh, no.
And that was kind of funny, but it wasn't really. But I was working for them and helped work with their data processing system. And amazingly, during college, I had worked at the Martinsville State Bank just as a teller, filing checks, but even also ran the posting machine, and it had some business classes. My dad had a heart attack and was quite serious. It was in the St. Vincent's Hospital in Indianapolis. My mother stayed over there, and I was over there, and I got a phone call one evening at the hotel from Lyle Wilkins, who was the president of the Martinsville Bank, and said, "How about coming to work for the bank? I'm going to retire." Well, okay, now another decision to make. So I did. I left Bentley's and went to Martinsville State Bank and was there for 13 years. Really expanded. We had quite a growth. It started with the thing called ATMs. Installed one in Marshall, started a branch in West Union, and then also a ATM in Martinsville. But also in the late 1880s was quite a terrible time with oil, with problems with grain, farms, land was a problem then. So the whole thing of economics we really got very, very rough. And we had a lot of oil from the Casey area, customers. So it got to be just a lot of toil and tension. So I said, oh gosh, this is about time for me to take a little lighter side. So I took my broker's license for selling stocks and bonds, annuities, and left the bank and started my own business of selling stocks and bonds, investments. First office I had in Terre Haute, and then joined LPL, which was called Linsco Private Ledger, which is an independent company which licenses agents. Now it's one of the larger ones. I think there's about 15,000 individuals like me who had individual offices throughout the country. They're California headquarters. So I had to take, again, all kinds of tests to become a branch manager, but I decided most of my business was in Marshall. It didn't make sense to drive to Terre Haute every day. So Dick King and his son Bill had bought the place, which used to be the old Ford Motor Credit, new building on the south side of the courthouse square. I went by there one night, and they were working inside getting Bill King's chiropractic office ready. I said, "Dick, what are you going to use that other side for?" And he said, "Well, we haven't decided yet." I said, "How about renting it?" So I negotiated with him, and they finally put the walls and stuff in where I wanted them. And that office is still there today, but I opened my office in 1988 or 1980 there. And had a very successful business. I enjoyed the people so much. But come time, kind of say, well, how about taking it a little easier? 1987 was the start of my business in Terre Haute. Eleanor had been teaching at Lincoln Trail College down in Robinson. Drove down there 7 years every day through ice and snow. She decided January 1st of 2000, call it quits. And that sounds kind of like a good idea. So just very ironically, the two people who bought my business, Susan Saxton and Vic Boyer, were going to open an LPL office in Paris, which they had already set everything up to do it. They called me just wanting to know more about the business and how I had success with it. So I said, hey, we need to talk. So they came down and we negotiated. So they bought my business, closed the office that they had established in Paris, and have been here ever since. And very, very successful. And I felt comfortable with them because they had the same philosophy that I did. Conservative, not trying to push your clients and customers into one thing or another, but also easing them into it and trying to make them feel comfortable. And they kept about all the customers that I had. And they're still at it, doing very, very well. So my wife and I both hung it up in early 2000 and haven't looked back, haven't regretted it a bit.
Very interesting, very interesting. Talk a little bit about your family life during this transition from Chicago area back to Marshall, and
As I said earlier,
how your kids
my
adapted.
childhood, my parents were always very, very supportive. They wanted me to make my own decisions, even though my dad was a very successful businessman, my mother was a teacher. They never tried to make decisions for me. So that decision with the house and jobs and all, they encouraged but never directed, so to speak. So the kids had reached the point in our life in Lake Forest. There were big schools. And again, I guess they were just a little questioning, what's this big school really going to be like? Our daughter would have been going into high school. And they were really kind of excited when we told them about Marshall because we had visited here. Of course, my parents lived in Martinsville. We visited here every other month. They had cousins here, the Mealing families. So it wasn't a total shock. But once the kids got here, they were excited. Even yesterday, when we were, this weekend, they were here. They both said, we're really glad we moved back to Marshall. And we had great classes, and I'm glad we didn't have to go to that big school in Lake Forest or the north. So it was a rather easy transition. I think the biggest thing was moving into a town where everyone knows you. My wife had a policy that the kids could go just about anywhere after school, but the first thing, you stopped by home first. She wanted to know. And I think it was the second week we were down here, because they had started school just about the time we moved. September, that was starting the school time. So one evening, I stopped in to see Paul Martin to pick up something. He said, oh, I had a nice visit. I enjoyed meeting your kids today. I said, gee, I wonder if they'd stop by home first, which they hadn't. So that night at the dinner table, my wife said, gee, you had a nice visit downtown today before you came home. What was that all about? We didn't do that. Oh, yes, you did. So anyway, they could not figure out, how did you know that? So it really made an emphasis that small town had its advantages, but also everyone knows you, knows what you're doing, and you need to keep your nose clean when you're in a small town. But I think they looked back and said, that was a good move also.
You've obviously had a lot of acquaintances throughout your life. Is there a single individual who you would name as being a major influence in your life?
I don't know if I could name one, but my parents were probably the biggest influence. But I did have a teacher in high school. She was from Marshall. The name Kiefer Drugstore. That was her granddaughter, or their granddaughter, was Jean Coleman. She taught English and library in Martinsville, and I enjoyed reading, of course, and wanted to work in the library. So she was a great one in, I guess, just kind of developing a feeling of you can do it. Because I was, I guess, really kind of timid before, wasn't aggressive at all. But she really guided me and put me in charge of the library finally. And if there was a book that was bad, I was to repair it, keep the card files at that time, up to date. And I really kind of attribute her for making that push into making decisions and getting involved. I will say also, I think the thing with music helped because I took lessons with Ruth Tarman all the way through high school, and she always had recitals. So that was, again, an idea of preparation. No one else can do it for you. You have to, and getting up in front, talking, and telling about the music you were playing, and then doing it. I had played all through band in high school. I played in band, marching band in Indiana State when I was there. And then we moved back to Marshall. Soon after, I joined the city band and played in it for 35 straight years. I decided 2 years ago, yeah, it was really time to put the clarinet aside and let the younger generation do it.
Did you take organ lessons? You evolved from piano playing to organ, I know.
Yes. Ruth Tarman had purchased a small Hammond organ, and she had it in her home or her studio. And one day I was down there and I said, "Oh, that looks fascinating." And she said, "Well, would you like to do that?" Because she was one of the organists at the Methodist Church in Martinsville. And I said, "Oh, yeah, I sure would." So I talked to my folks. I wasn't sure. She said, "But now you're going to have to find a place to practice." I had a piano at home. So she started, and she said, "Oh, you're doing pretty well." So after about the second lesson on the organ, I was on my bicycle going home and went by the Greenwell Funeral Home. And Joy Greenwell was sitting on the front porch. Wonderful friend, wonderful person. And I stopped. Maybe it was that pushing and that having nerve. I stopped. "Joy, I'm taking organ lessons. I know you've got the same organ right there in your front room. Would it be all right if I came down here and practiced once in a while? Because Mrs. Tarman says I need a place to practice and I don't have an organ yet." "Oh, sure, come on down just any time. We'd be glad to have you. Just so we don't have visitation or something." Well, I told Mother and Dad that, and I thought they were going to run right into orbit. "Oh, you don't want to interrupt them. You cannot be." She said, "Okay." So I practiced down there for about a year, and that was a big, big help because that helped move me along, and then my folks did my spinet organ for the home. And about that same time, there was a pastor here called Monsignor Father Donahue, who you probably
I remember, yes.
Who was just a wonderful friend of the community's. And we had a large old organ at the church, and I remember him saying one Sunday, "The old beast up there is just giving us fits, and you know we can buy a brand new organ for less money than it's going to take to repair that." So they took it out and bought a new spinet Hammond organ, just exactly like the one my music teacher had. Well, there was a couple people that played that. One was out for a while, I think, with having a child, and the other one was Jerry Keyes. Wilson Keyes was her husband, who worked for Velsico. She was kind of there one Sunday and not. So I said to Father Donahue, I said, "I'm taking organ lessons now. Would it be okay to play?" "Oh, yes, we need music. Take care of it whenever there's no one here." So I started playing. Well, that didn't set too well with her, so she kind of bailed out, and I ended up playing 2 services from, I guess, about my probably 8th grade on all through high school. With that, I think that interested in organ, and I was never wanting to be a performer, but the clarinet, piano, and organ was just always a part of my life. When we moved to Chicago, I had the organ at home, so my folks brought it up to me. We had it there. Very soon in Evanston, they needed an organist at St. Athanasius Church where we went. There were several people there, but she came and talked to me, so I got into the organ routine there. When we moved to Lake Forest, same situation. They didn't have a full-time organist, so I played one Sunday, every other Sunday in St. Mary's. So I always had that contact, I guess, with the organ. And interestingly enough, when we moved, Margaret Ferris was, she had been teaching in Martinsville, and she was doing the organ. And I think it was about a month before we moved back, her husband Don had a transfer. He was postmaster, was transferred to Robinson. So right at the time she was leaving, I think the week before was the week we moved back. So I kind of picked up where I'd been 15 years ago and been playing 2 services every weekend ever since. Fortunately, I do have a backup now, and she takes care of the choir and the last weekend of the month. And if we're gone for long extended periods or in Florida, she does take care of it then. But most weekends of the year, I play 2 services, Saturday night and Sunday morning. So after 35 years of kind of hanging up the clarinet, I'm still at the organ console. Or piano. I practice on piano at home once in a while too.
I know since you've been back in Marshall, you've been very interested in community activities. Want to talk a little bit about your involvement in Marshall's betterment?
I guess I've always had an interest in history, architecture, as I mentioned even about the buying of the house. For several years, I was president of the Clark County Historical Society. And after I was finished, my wife was president of that several years. I also had an interest in, old buildings and what was going on in Marshall, and that thing kind of led along a little bit. I was vice president for a number of years, the Chamber of Commerce. Then there was a thing called Main Street started. It was a charter member event, which again is encouraging business, working with preservation. I was treasurer of Main Street for, I think, 7 years, even getting it started, and enjoyed that so much. Again, you can see what's happening and trying to kind of restore downtown. We had a lot of buildings painted, and we got recognition of the state also and nationally for our efforts in the Main Street program. Probably the largest thing was in my interest in preservation. When I had my business, and again with the Main Street, Pat McCammon, who was the director of Main Street, came over one day and said, "Are you aware of what might happen to the old building where the Moose is?" I said, "I'd heard some rumors. The Moose owned that lodge, but we're having some trouble, and we're probably going to liquidate it." So I said, "Gee, that would be a shame if that got sold and something happened to it." So we went to the Historical Society. We were not involved with it at that time, but just got nowhere there. They were not interested in it at all. But the guy that owned the grocery store at that time, the IGA, Red and White, was wanting to buy it, demolish it for parking or expansion. We also heard the gentleman who owned the car dealership might want that for a new car dealership and have the used cars in across the street where they were. Oh my gosh, those would be just tragedies. So I talked to the folks at the Moose, and yeah, they were probably going to have to liquidate it. I got a copy of the abstract, or they gave me the abstract to look through, and I thought, oh my goodness, there's all kinds of history here. Well, we can't let that go. So Pat and I both got our heads together and said, gosh, we've got to do something. So that time the city was looking for a community center. We got Bud Bloodworth on the side. And he said, yeah, that would be a good community center, because about that time, our state representative, Dale Ryder, had arranged and got a $100,000 grant for the city of Marshall to use for a community center. He said, So working with the city and also with the grant and Dale, the city agreed then to buy that building, and they negotiated and got the price down to where it was manageable. And about that time also, a lady died and granted $50,000 in her will for the preservation of Harlan Hall. And we said, oh my gosh, now we're going. The city bought it, and they were kind of anxious. They wouldn't do things right away. And we said, no, it's got to be done right and really, really preserved. And some of the city was not too hip at that time, but we kind of held them at advance, and we got really just volunteers. And as you know, there were about 6 or 7 people got together, started working on weekends, taking the old stuff out. I don't know how many trucks of junk went out of that building. Started with an engineer and a architect, Bud Ernie from Vincennes, because he had done the building at church for us. And Jim Schwartz knew him, I knew him, and he did a great job for us, not pushing anything, but was trying to conserve dollars. Here's what you can do, but here's an alternative you might want to consider. Anyway, he said the building is super sound, it needs some work, but here's what you can do. So he drew up some plans based on what we were willing to use the building for. And that was about a 10-year experience. Putting the downstairs floor together, we did most of that with volunteer work. The city helped with putting up some of the studding and the ceiling. We were able to get 10 ceilings duplicated with what was there originally. But it was really a matter of putting a puzzle of pieces back together, kind of the way it might have been in the 1870s when it was built. The downstairs were horse stalls at one time, and some of the old wood beams and bracketing were still there for the stalls. The Moose Lodge had put a drop ceiling in and paneling and then rooms all over the place. So it was a lot to tear out, but we found a lot of things under in the skeleton. And I don't know how the place kept from burning down with the stringing of wires that was through there. But we did all the wiring basically ourselves on the first floor. And got it put back together the way that architect designed for us. And right away we had the meals, which had one time been Meals on Wheels, and then was a daily program. Having those, got a person to fix the meals. And we're really going with a community service. So it really wasn't much upstairs we could do because that took a lot of work, but we kept at it. And even did a lot of the volunteer work up there too. Got another grant. The city was able to get a grant for finishing it for the visitor center of the National Road, because Main Street is a certified scenic byway. So that helped us a lot too, in putting in an elevator, doing electrical work, plumbing upstairs, things of that nature was a grant, but still these volunteers did things like painting, sanding the floor upstairs, which shows a huge surface. And it must have been it was battleship gray, it must have been battleship paint, because it was just nearly impossible to sand down. I think we used 3 or 4 sanders and burned up one of them just trying to get that floor clean. And refinished it ourselves. Picked out light fixtures. A lot of the rewiring was done. Through Tom Stone's effort also, he replaced the ceiling. But we finally got it to a hall that was suitable for receptions, performances. Some of the banks helped with getting a new collapsible stage with professional lights, putting in a sound system, dressing rooms back of the stage. We had a nice piano donated. Many other things came along as people saw that happening. We even had a program called Have a Seat at Harlan Hall, because with that big a hall, you needed places for people to sit if they were attending a reception. We got enough donations, people could buy a folding chair. I believe it was $25. We got enough money for 300 folding chairs. We got nice padded ones, upholstered ones, not just hard surface. And we got enough money over that to buy, I believe it was 20 tables, folding tables, and the racks, here we go, and the racks to hang them on. So people really came out and helped us. And that kind of was a springboard also from a lot of the efforts we had had with the Main Street, because the streetscape, Main Street had been very vital in getting new sidewalks, getting new lights, and seeing that change. So people saw what local people can do, and I think helped spark what was happening at Harlan Hall. After that, I was appointed, the mayor asked me to be director of or chairman of the Historic Preservation Commission, and was on that 6 years. We had, I think, a lot of benefits made in making people aware of preservation, trying to keep what you have and not losing history. We had a program of naming historic buildings, and several of those were named with a plaque put on them, and that's, of course, recognized. We were able to get the entire downtown area on the National Register of Historic Places. And I had written the National Register nomination for Harlan Hall, and it's also individually on. So Harlan Hall and the entire downtown is on the National Register, and we've also got landmarks in that area too, as well as throughout the town.
One last question, Damian. If you, having lived in Evanston, places like Evanston and Lake Forest, hypothetically, if you ran into somebody you knew from 40 years ago, and they asked about you and where you lived, and they expressed amazement that you would move from places like that to a little town downstate Illinois, how would you describe Marshall and why you chose to live here?
I would say my major reason probably for moving back was the family ties that I had going back to the first thing I started. My great-great-grandparents were actually here before Marshall was founded. My family is here. The association I'd had with the church, I've now been a church organist for 67 years plus. My parents were active and alive at that time, and the people are of a small town, and the feeling that if you got a problem, they will help you out. You just don't find that kind of attitude and feeling in most cities, and certainly not even in suburbs the size of Evanston and Lake Forest. You got wonderful neighbors, but yet you don't have that feeling of, if you're really in desperation, you've got someone at your back to help you out. Also, I think Marshall is so clean and neat. Most streets and the properties are well kept. Certainly Evanston was fabulous, Lake Forest was the same, but many towns the size of Marshall do not have that image and that picture of someone coming into town. Plus, I think the last one is feeling safe. In the city now, especially, you hear so much about problems, the safety of robbery, all kinds of things happening. It can happen anywhere, but you feel a little better about living in Marshall, that that's probably not going to happen down the street from where you live.
Okay, thank you, Damian. Anything else you
No,
wish to
I
add?
thank you, Steve. I believe, I think again, we have such a wonderful library here that I'm glad to be a part of this project, because it's not for today or tomorrow, as I've said before, but it's really for the future, that someone will listen or look at this, gee, I didn't know that, and may fill some gaps about some of the people that have been a part of Marshall over the years. So I thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, and that concludes our interview. Hope it took.